A lot of Harry Potters here. This
Yeah,
background.
the question was whether Dr. Gonzalez's background is Harry Potter or Cornell.
So beautiful.
Yes, and you can answer in the chat.
Okay. So I will answer that it is actually Cornell. It is it's part of our School of Law building. And right through here, there is apparently a little kind of room that has stairs going up. And apparently there is a secret room there for one of the secret societies. And I said, well, now that I know that where the room is, I'm going to go. I'm going to figure out the secret room, right? Apparently, it is so hard that there is literally no way. Like the person who actually was taken there at one point, they're like, you couldn't possibly figure out how to get in there, which of course makes me think challenge accepted. I have to figure out how to get into this room. So Cornell Law Building.
Very cool.
I'm rooting for you. Let us know if you get in there.
That is so thoughtful of you to put it there. It really looks great.
Yeah. Wonderful. So it is 10:31 and we are here together, gathered, and this is the time as folks continue to arrive. We will begin with our webinar today. So I just need to make sure, yes, we are recording. So a warm welcome to everyone here. Good morning and welcome again to our day one of our 24th annual Making Healthful Decisions conference and our second virtual version of this event. My name is Julika von Stackelberg. I am with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Orange County. And as one of the organizers of this event, it is my great pleasure to be here with you all. This conference is made possible with the generous support from our sponsors, including Garnet Health, the Orange County Youth Bureau, and the United Way, as well as with support from the Child Care Council in Orange County. I also want to give a very big shout out to our team of organizers and a big thank you, some of whom have been with this event since its inception. So thank you, Dr. Andrew Bell with the Westchester Department of Children's Services, Children's Mental Health, and Annie Colonna with the Warwick Valley Community Center, Whitney Force with Garnet Health, Amanda Langsetter with Sullivan 180, Susie McCormick with Cornell Cooperative Extension, who is also here helping to facilitate the chat, and Moira Mencher with Garnet Health, Brianna Pinos Grande with MISN, Robin Rosenberg with Mount St. Mary College, Jenny Sanchez with Sullivan 180, Stephanie Sosnowski with Garnet Health, Melinda Ware with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Sullivan County, and Grace Welly with MISN. And I can't help but to also really thank and welcome the two babies that joined us in this time that we've been planning the conference. So welcome to our literalist members here too. And of course, to our colleagues in Delaware, at CCE in Delaware County. Everyone's flexibility, support, patience, thoughts, and planning are what got us here together today. So I'd like to walk you through a brief perspective of what to expect in the next few hours. We will begin today with a phenomenal keynote presentation, which will be followed by a brief Q&A. Or we might have some time for some good Q&A. So make sure you note down some questions that you have along the way. And you'll be able to submit your questions for that through the Q&A feature of this webinar on your screen. And you can use the chat to share any comments along the way. Like you can, continue to admire the beautiful backgrounds that everyone has. So this session will end at 12 noon. And give you a chance to have lunch, take a stretch, or tend to what you need to do. We will then return for our afternoon workshops that are all taking place simultaneously. You should have received the link that will get you to the workshop that you registered for. If you need assistance, we'll be able to do that via email. The best way to email is jv426@cornell.edu. We will put that in the chat for you in just a moment. And all of these sessions will be recorded, and all registered participants will get the recordings of all sessions in this conference. And now I am delighted to introduce our very special guest today, Dr. Anjana Punthata, to you, who is the Medical Director of Women's and Children's Services at Garnet Health, as well as the Pediatric Hospitalist for Garnet Health Doctors. Dr. Punthata has a very special welcome to us today.
Thank you, Julika. Thank you, everybody, for having me here today. What an honor to be a part of this program, and thank you for your warm welcome. So as a pediatrician, it is truly an honor to be molding and shaping the future who are our children and adolescents. And I take a lot of pride in addressing this every day of my profession, because children do play a major role, and it is sad to see the stressors they're going through. As we know, children are our future. Amongst the age groups in pediatric population, adolescent age group is very unique. This is a crucial and important time period when children are transitioning into adulthood, developing social and emotional habits for their important mental well-being. And this is such a formative time for them as well. So it's very important for us to provide the protective and supportive environments, both at family, at school, and not only that, but in the wider community as well. We know that they're vulnerable to external triggers like poverty. They might come from social backgrounds that are broken, abuse, violence, and all these factors can affect their physical, emotional, and social changes. Protecting all our adolescents from adversity, promoting their social and emotional well-being and learning, and their psychological well-being will make sure that we're addressing critical areas for their healthcare. And by doing so, this is going to promote the well-being during adolescence and adulthood. Globally, many of these adolescents remain largely unrecognized and untreated because there's a lot of underdiagnosis. We know that adolescents lack coping skills. They may not seek help appropriately. And moreover, these children are often socially isolated and discriminated. Social media influence, gender disparity, gender norms, they can all affect them negatively, thereby increasing these stressors. Their quality of life at home, school, their relationship with their peers, all of these play a vital role as well. Very harsh parenting, very harsh schooling, bullying, violence, and socioeconomic problems, they're all factors that are recognized as risk factors to their mental health. Some adolescents are at greater risk due to their living conditions, due to lack of access to quality of care, support, services, or they might be living in fragile settings. And this can be worse for adolescents with chronic illnesses and behavioral disorders, intellectual disabilities, and neurological conditions underlying this. And pregnant adolescent parents, or children who are forced to marry early, orphans, or children who come from broken backgrounds and discriminated groups are vulnerable to these stressors as well. Adolescence is difficult no matter what, and the recent life-altering pandemic from COVID-19 is making it even harder for these children. Not only are they dealing with the physical ailments, but with virtual learning, there are school closures, a lot of events are canceled, and many of these adolescents are missing out on some of the biggest events in their lives. Everyday moments like chatting with friends, participating in class, these can contribute to a lot of social and emotional well-being, but by being socially isolated, this can affect their social skills and mental health. It is our job as parents, teachers, pediatricians to support all our adolescents facing these life changes from this outbreak or feeling anxious, isolated, and disappointed. At Garnet Health, we're dedicated to serve these vulnerable children. We have a team of pediatricians, child psychiatrists who provide support to these children. And we actually care for them until they find inpatient placement for mental health treatment. As responsible adults today, my message to everybody is to recognize how overwhelmed these adolescents are, address their fears and stressors. Let us all provide them with the stability and support by teaching them coping skills. And let us provide the message to them and strengthen them, saying that you're anxious, isolated, and disappointed, but just understand that you're not alone. Let us help them stay connected and maintain good health, because they are the future of our world. Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Punzata. Your welcome really outlines the topic for our conversation so well, and we really appreciate your care and your work. And we know that you will have to go back to your work just after this, so we appreciate that you were able to take your time for this.
Thank you so much. And once I'm done with the rounds, anytime I have, I'll be logging in again. Thank you very much, everybody.
Wonderful. So it is my great pleasure now to introduce to you our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Marlen Gonzalez, to you. Dr. Gonzalez is an assistant professor of human development at the College of Human Ecology at Cornell University. And she completed her undergraduate studies at Manhattanville College and received her Ph.D. in clinical psychology from the University of Virginia. Her research interests center on how development context shapes the adult brain and what it means for dimensions of normative behaviors as well as non-communicative disease, such as mental health and cardiovascular health. By developmental context, she means the totality of our childhood environment, the physical, social, political, and economic affordances and dangers which make demands of us. Welcome, Dr. Gonzalez.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen, and please let me know if something is not quite right. Okay, can everyone see that?
Perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me and for the introduction. So I'm really here, yes, as myself, but also as the director of the Community Neuroscience Initiative as part of Cornell University. This is exactly the kind of thing that I'm hoping that we can do as neuroscientists. It feels really terrible to be, I think, locked away from people like you guys who actually do the work of working with, youth every single day. We have things that we can do to help, and we want to help. So thank you for allowing me this opportunity, so I'm not just stuck in the lab all the time. Okay, so a little bit about me, though I think that Julika really covered all the bases. So I'm the director of the Life History Lab. These pictures are just an excuse for me to show you my lab. All of these people are really interested in this idea of how the environment shapes the brain. So Marissa Rice is Dr. Rice. She's my postdoc, and she looks at space and the way our use of space actually ends up changing our memory systems and motivational systems in the brain. These are my new graduate students. Dr. Samantha de Leon Sautu, she's actually a medical doctor in Panama. And this is Aisha Sadiq, who is really interested in food justice and the way that food affects the brain as well. So I can speak to you both in the capacity of as a neuroscientist, but also as a clinical psychologist. I also was part of the National Crime Victims Center in Charleston. And so I have a little bit of an idea of this idea of the way that context shapes us, not just at the neural level, but at multiple levels, thinking about it. Okay, so the Community Neuroscience Initiative is both an extension of my work and yet something that isn't all, that is more than its sum of its parts, let's say.
Dr. Gonzalez, sorry,
Yes.
a quick interruption. You are like me. I talk with my hands all the time too. I think your hand keeps going on the microphone, so we hear a lot of crackle, crackle. You're good, just so you're aware.
Thank you for letting me know. Yeah, I do speak with my hands a lot. That's like half of the communications over here. So thank you, Julika. Okay, so the founding principles of CNI, you know, first of all, really the program, what it's trying to do is seek to remove barriers to really have everyone in the community participate in neuroscience, both as consumers and as active co-creators. I want to make sure that people are, especially parents, honestly, are armed with enough knowledge, and providers armed with enough knowledge so that when the latest thing comes in of like, do this and this will be the best thing for your health, and if this thing ever happens to you is really terrible for your brain. And I just want to make sure that people can approach things with curiosity for sure, but without necessarily blind obedience. So definitely what we want to do is democratize neuroscience. We want to make sure we're using neuroscience for translation. And we also want to emphasize neurodiversity as part of biological diversity to begin with. There are many ways to be diverse, and I'm not just talking about what you would put in like a DSM-4 sort of context, but we all carry with us the imprints of our context, and that makes us all to some extent quite diverse neurally. They're very real individual differences. All of this is made possible by collaborators and the Bronfenbrenner Center, and we have some really cool stuff coming out that's going to get into schools and be teaching not just students, but also teachers and the New York State education system about neuroscience and how we can use it in education. So very excited about it. Okay, random. Okay, why should we really care about neuroscience? Yes, a good answer is because it's cool. But you specifically are people who are working with youth all the time. What can neuroscience really do for you? Well, I think that neuroscience can sometimes be directly helpful because it tells you something about where the individual might be, where their capabilities might be, and the expected sort of trajectory. And at the same time, sometimes what neuroscience does is just give you an extra layer to something you already know. I mean, the title of my talk is essentially about how context shapes the brain. But of course, you all know that context shapes the individual. You all know that you have a profound effect on the students that or youth that you work with, or certainly if you have your own children. We know this. I don't need to tell you that it's happening in the brain for it to be interesting or meaningful, but it adds this extra layer. And sometimes the fact that it is an extra layer creates a newness, and there's a new understanding and less sort of defensiveness against some of the ideas that get brought up about youth, especially some misunderstanding. Okay, so the goals for today is I'm going to use neuroscience in order to really engender empathy towards not just the youth that you serve, but also towards yourself. And if you're a supervisor of people who work directly with youth, towards them as well, because you guys have brains too. We're also going to think about strategies with a purpose. Can we use neuroscience? Not necessarily me telling you like this is an application and I've done an RCT, you know, I've run studies on it, but more of like, can we use this knowledge to creatively brainstorm how we approach the problems that we are seeing today? And finally, this is also all a kind of planting seeds towards this idea of community neuroscience. Of can we all take this this responsibility to each other, not just to our children, but to each other, to make sure we have healthy developing brains and people for the long term, right? In a lifespan. view. All right, so what we're going to cover in this is first, we're going to learn a little neurodevelopment. And I titled it, It's Not Aliens, It's Neurodevelopment. And this is because a parent recently said to me, they were talking about their teenage child, and they said, I really want like a parenting class that says, you know, the aliens stole my baby, help, you know. It's not aliens, it's neurodevelopment. There's a lot of things that are happening that create these very different personality, what seems like very different personalities, or they're trying out new things. But I think I aim to show you how much change truly is going on. Again, to engender some empathy and understanding. I swear they'll come back. So we're going to look at some ecological developmental theories, really big picture. We're going to learn a little neuroanatomy and then some principles of brain development. I'm also going to try to convince you that when we think about context, a lot of the times for the human being specifically, because of the way we've evolved through time, other humans end up being a huge part of the way our brain adapts and the way our brain grows. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about sensitive periods as possible, yes, areas where there's usually a little bit of difficulty, but also areas where there can be a lot of opportunity, and how maybe we can work with it rather than working against them. Okay, so straight into the theories. So this whole thing is about how the brain develops in context. Oftentimes people believe that there's some sort of just unfolding that happens all on its own. And it's like a program, you press start and then it keeps going. And maybe if there's hiccups, something gets messed up. But no, by design, there is this attunement that is happening over and over. And we can think about it even from just the behavioral level, where when we look at these two neighborhoods, the kind of skills that you need to survive in one versus the other, you might imagine are not exactly the same. And although we are used to thinking about, for example, the area that looks impoverished as necessarily something that's going to cause deficits in the brain, that's not necessarily true. Within the context of the demands of this area, it may be perfectly reasonable to trade off certain skills. For example, a really reward sensitive profile that might be less into executive function, because you got to get it while the getting is good, and the lifespan is shorter. There's a lot more danger in there. A lot of resources are spent towards vigilance, and maybe less is spent towards the kinds of things that over here in this dominant sort of society, or the society that has power, part of society that has power is prized, right? Sustained attention. Maybe sustained attention in this area is not quite as useful. Okay, so I'm going to start you off with a really important developmental question. And I think you know where this is going if you know what this is. How does a bastard orphan, son of a whore and a Scotsman, dropped in the middle of the forgotten spot in the Caribbean by providence, impoverished and squalor, grow up to be a hero and a scholar? This is a fundamental developmental question. How does the developmental context shape who we become? There's also something here. How could he possibly become this great thing? There's an implicit theory here of development, of how could that someone who experiences hardship necessarily must be somehow maybe broken, or something must be wrong with them. I'm going to suggest through these kinds of evolutionary developmental theory that it's a little bit more complex than that. We as a society may value certain things, and that's totally legitimate. But if we don't provide the environments for that adult phenotype, right, traits to really develop, that doesn't mean that physiology is wrong. It's only trying to make do with what's around it. So thinking about an evolutionary developmental theory, there are many ways to nuances, but for our purposes, we just want to think about it as this kind of addition problem. So first you have the clay, that's your genes, your genetics. And in it, you have these lovely neurotransmitters, which are related to reward, motivation, social affiliation, and mood. And your genes sometimes are thought of as, just programs that kind of just go off, but actually they listen in through a process called epigenetics into the environment, which is like a mold. This mold presses against the clay. Now, we do have individual differences where some people are more susceptible to the environment than others. So this clay is much more moldable. And of course, different systems can be differentially moldable. But for our purposes, it's just good to know, really, this environment, depending where you land on here, is going to shape this malleable physiological systems, and specifically the brain. So then finally, we get at this adult phenotype, who we become, and of course, we're interested in the brain. And on top of that, because nature is quite redundant and complicated, you don't just have like from genetics to molding to this, there's actually these bidirectional relationships. So for example, yes, you go from genes to environment to some sort of trait, but your traits can actually influence your environment and can influence your, not your genes necessarily, but the expression of your genes. So for example, babies who smile more tend to get a lot more adult attention, which in turn then changes some of the epigenetic processes, which actually very specifically impacts the development of oxytocin receptors, which becomes really useful later on when it comes to social perception and bonding, right? So all it was just a smiley baby who got a little bit more attention, and then you have this back and forth, this spiraling. And so it's really
Dr.
important
Gonzalez,
to think about that.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to chime in one more time with the microphone. We have it goes sometimes in and out, so that's
This is so weird. I've never had a problem with the microphone before. Is it better when I do this?
Yes, so long as your hand doesn't cover it, I think.
Okay. All right. I'm not making this better. I've never had this problem before. Thank you for stopping me.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So first we want to cover the kind of stuff that's considered the program that you sort of press play on and goes on, because then we can start to get to this idea of well, yes, this is happening, but it's still listening in here. Okay, so some principles of brain development. If right now there's a little part of you that's like having a little, anxiety, STEM anxiety or something, it can't be harder than, guiding you through a pandemic while you're dealing with your own reactions to these incredible stressors. So you got this, I swear. Okay, so some light neuroanatomy. So importantly for us, I'm going to start you in the back and then move forward, and you'll see why. So we've got our brain stuff. That's the stuff that's keeping us breathing and alive. We've got the cerebellum, which is about balance and coordination. And then we get to the stuff that people like really get into. So we have visual perception and interpretation, not just seeing, but perceiving as well. And perceiving is changed by context. We have the things that are related to bodily perception, the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. We're dealing with language. This becomes very important in early on development. And again, very much related to what's the input that I'm receiving. Babies can hear tones that you no longer can hear as you're an adult because these things get pruned away. And then you have the frontal lobe, and this is the one that we obsess a lot about because we want children to have self-control. And of course, this is the part that develops the latest. So this is all getting to some core principles about how does this beautiful organ develop, and it develops kind of the way that I said it. So there's these principles of what's happening in brain development where you're going from the back, so from this the occipital kind of visual areas to the frontal executive areas. You're also going inside out. So all of this gushy stuff in the middle is a lot of the limbic system, which is essentially emotions, motivations, motor control, what you would expect, what you see, right, in children also as they develop. Then I think there's this interesting piece, which if you get anything from me, this is the piece that I want you to get, which is that the brain grows in this kind of progress to regress. And what that means is you'll see these proliferations of neurons or synaptic connections, so connections between neurons, and then you'll see this pruning, this specialization. We actually lose a lot of connections, and in losing a lot of connections, we end up actually gaining more skill and specificity. So losing connections is not necessarily a bad thing, it's specialization. And you'll see this across the lifespan. So for example, in postnatal development, and you can actually see this with in the fetus as well, but in postnatal development, you'll see this trajectory. So on the one hand, our gray matter from ages 5 to 22 is going down. And gray matter is sort of what we come out with. It's like the country roads of your brain. But then white matter increases over time, and that's the highways of your brain. And you see that it peaks around age 22. I'm 35. Everything's going downhill from now. No, not really, but there is a different trajectory that is happening. And luckily, our brain is extremely redundant and plastic. And so other pieces actually start to pick up many different functions. So you see this sort of, progress to regress. If I were showing you the fetal brain, you would see, again, progress to regress, but then the total brain volume remains the same. You'll see also this same thing when it comes to connectivity between different regions of the brain. And remember that there's going from inside to out, from back to the front, and it's the same principle when it comes to connectivity. So progress to regress, again, you see these kind of curves, but then front to back, you see that some curves have a kind of a different apex, right? The apexes are different. And then you'll see specifically, this is like the going all the way from the back to the front, that has like the apex closer to 19, right? So what's happening here is that the brain is constantly having these periods of growth, pruning, and it's doing so in those patterns that we talked about. And those are the moments when the context is really having an impact in what's going on. So this is the magic of how you get these specialized language and motor coordination and all sorts of wonderful behaviors and also connectivity in the brain. Okay, so that's how it unfolds, right? So it's really conspiratorial, right? But specifically, what constitutes a sort of the environment? What are the things that we believe are having a really big impact when it comes to these kinds of how the brain decides to prune the sides, how pruning occurs, what gets kind of taken away? And I'm going to try to convince you that for human beings, at least, it appears to be other human beings. So this is Cueva de las Manos, right? This is about 10,000 years old. These hands are specters from people 10,000 years old. I find it very evocative in terms of just letting you know how deeply social human beings are. We depend on each other. And here are our ancestors with 10,000 years ago deciding to put some paint in their hands and create this. And I find that fascinating. And it shows you how much our social behaviors are really ingrained in us. And we've survived because of how we depend on each other. So I always like to illustrate rather than just tell you. So I need you to go ahead and imagine, right? Take a moment. There's going to be multiple spaces where I'm going to ask you to do a little something, something. So I want you to imagine that you're in a dark place and it's very noisy and you're about to have a somewhat uncomfortable, maybe even painful medical procedure. You're sweating, your heart is racing. Then I want you to imagine someone who really loves you and is really dependable. They reach out, they hold your hand. Now, if you're like most people, you imagine that person automatically starts to reduce that stress that you feel. Your heart rate goes down, your concerns sort of start to be stripped away. They're not completely gone, but something happens to the body that literally says, oh, you're safe now, here's someone else. And it turns out that that subjective feeling is really seen also in the brain. So when individuals are, specifically what I described to you is being in an MRI scanner, which scans the blood flow in your brain while you're doing tasks. When an individual is being threatened with shock, when they're alone versus when they're holding the hands of a partner, they actually show far more sort of threat-related activation while alone, and that is reduced by the hand of a partner. That simple hand holding makes the brain act quite different. And it does so in a way that is not about one part of the brain telling the other part of the brain to calm down, but rather it seems to be the baseline, as if that's the expectation that you always have people around you, which makes sense considering, like, you know, how useless we are as infants, right? Like other animals are like up and running, but not us. We need a lot of care and a lot of attention. So what we've shown here is the importance at the neural level and the sort of baseline quality of other social relationships, how deeply important they are. And we've expanded this to show that relationship quality, so how good that relationship is, will matter to the system, not necessarily the type, with the exception that sometimes marriage seems to create a stronger effect. We see also that people tend to process threat to themselves very similarly as threat to loved ones, indicating that we are sort of simpatico with each other at a very low level, right, at a physiological level. And then finally, we've also shown that your sort of ability or propensity to have this kind of benefit, this kind of lowering of stress response in the presence of a trusted other, ends up actually doing more than just in that moment. It ends up helping you later on with different challenges. So we did this study and we looked at the changes in blood flow in what's called right in the prefrontal cortex, which we've learned is really one, later development and also related to like executive function and control. So we looked at the individual differences in changes here, and then we mapped it on to the way individuals respond to a social rejection paradigm. And you see this correlation where individuals here who have the highest sort of difference, so they really benefited from handholding, also have this lower neural activation in response to social rejection. Again, this sort of like benefit carries over. So it's not just in that moment that it's good to have that social presence. That social presence in and of itself also shapes how the brain perceives threats, especially these kind of social threats later on. So keeps on giving. Importantly, there's a little something else when we think about coping. So how is this related to actual skills and executive function, for example? And you see this interesting interaction. So first, let me orient you. So on the y-axis, this is self-regulation, right? You're really interested in that. Oftentimes, so this is through something called the brief cope. And it captures really the kinds of things that people do that are very cerebral in terms of like how to control your emotions. So reevaluating a situation, doing something about it, right? Like planning. So this is an amalgamation of that. And then over here is that yielding, right? So the propensity to sort of neurally at the neural level allow someone else to share the burden. So less sort of activation there. And what you see is individuals who yield a lot, regardless of how they react to social rejection, they're really not doing much self-regulation. In a sense, they kind of don't need to that much, right? They're relying on others. I think what's really interesting is that then when you get here to individuals who don't do that, who don't get very much of the benefit of being with others, you start to see, especially for those that are also just socially insensitive to rejection, they're using that kind of self-regulation skills at ceiling. And so I think some of you might have seen this before, but you ever meet somebody who is so utterly self-controlled is actually a problem, right? Everything needs to be controlled. Everyone needs to be kept at bay. So despite the fact that this is, quote, a good thing, right? Self-control is a good thing. It also may mean that it's a moment of missed opportunity where we can actually lessen the load on the body by being accepting of others' help. Okay, so this doesn't just happen because of personal relationships. Other aspects of the social world are changing us. So yes, our families, friends, social networks, but also our institutions, right? And our community. So for example, in my work, we've seen that neighborhood quality is related to, so the higher the neighborhood quality, the lower your sort of neural response to social rejection, as well as the lower your neural response to monetary rewards. And this is suggestive of a kind of adaptation to these environments that allow one to navigate those particular demands, right, that are there. But even beyond that, very recently, and this is a preprint, so really need to look at the methods, but very recently, these researchers looked at 17 states and 11,000 children and looked at the neural data and showed that the correlation between SES and volume in this area called the hippocampus, which is generally related to memory, that relationship, right, which is generally negative, so lower SES and is lower kind of hippocampal volume, that relationship is dependent, at least in part, on the kinds of social policies that are in place for the specific places. So there were 17 different states, and those states that had more progressive, kind of making sure that families are getting income, lower SES families are getting more income or help, that mitigated that connection. So again, it's not just individual relationships, it's also our community and structures around it that are impacting neural development. Okay, so putting it all together, there comes these moments in time, neurodevelopmentally, where there's a kind of almost like a thinning of the veil, if you will, between what's going on in the brain and how the environment is permeating it. And these kinds of moments I call sensitive periods. So sensitive periods are moments by which experience, a specific experience or a lack of experience, can have this profound effect in what your brain is going to look like when you're an adult. And so in many ways, your brain in childhood and adolescence is trying to prepare, right, for future skills that you will need based on your current environment, right? So those sensitive periods are moments where your brain is really listening in and saying, do I need this or can I prune it off? Because it's expensive, you know, I got to eat so much to make this work. So sensitive periods end up being really important. So again, thinking about, you know, right, the development of white matter and gray matter, a lot of this stuff, if you look at it, so here's the volume increase, right, in green, you'll see the white matter is increasing over time and then decreasing. And then you'll see with volume increases, Same thing, lots of growth, and then it gets smaller and smaller as time goes on. And the sensitive periods are in those moments where you see a shift, where there's shifts happening in how much growth and pruning that are occurring. So a good way to illustrate kind of sensitive period is to think about something as easy as face perception. Easy. Okay, so this was actually made by one of my students. So this area in the brain called the fusiform face gyrus is called that way because when it comes to seeing stimuli that are non-social, although there's some argument about this, but in general, non-social, it kind of like just doesn't care. It's not particularly sensitive to it. But the moment there's anything face-like, this includes googly eyes, right? So even things that are more anthropomorphized, you see this great activation as if it's really attending to the social features of faces, but even action. Why does this matter? Well, first, let's do a little task. So we're gonna play a game called, Is This Your Primate? And what's going to happen is I'm going to show you the face of a primate, and then I'm going to count 2 seconds, and then I'm going to show you another primate, and your goal is to say, is that the primate that I saw, or is that a different primate, right? The pictures won't be exactly the same. They'll be having different expressions, or they'll be taken kind of a different angle. So it's really trying to challenge you. Is this your primate? All right, so first we're gonna go ahead and do it, okay? Okay, take a moment. Is this your primate? Were the two primates the same? Is number 1 and number 2 the same? I'm gonna actually wait a little because I want you to think about it. I'll even do it again.
And we can put the answers in the chat, correct?
Yes. I want to see if we can do this. Yes, it's the same one. Okay, so there's some arguments here. Now I'm thinking, no. Okay. All right. So this face perception stuff is hard, right? Oof, there's some back and forth. So I'm gonna make it easier for us. Okay. I actually don't know whether these are the same ones. These are specific stimuli from a study that was done with this exact idea of face perception. And can you determine whether that's the same primate, right? Okay, I can't do this one. So I'm gonna do another one. Now that we've gotten started and we know the game, again, is this your primate? I'm going to show you the face of a primate, and then I'm going to show you a second one. And then your goal is to determine whether that was the same primate or not. Okay, ready? Okay. Was that the same primate? Yeah, we're really good at this one, right? We're great at it. It's not difficult. And the thing is, even though this is really difficult for us, for babies, not so much. They do great at that first task. And that's partially because what's happening is at 3 months old, these babies, when you show them different pictures and then you show again a kind of different, a different pose, they will pay attention to a face that they have seen before more, regardless of the race of the individual. This was done in all white babies. So they're looking at these different faces in pictures, and they're able to seemingly through viewing things that they are able to tell that this is the same individual. But once you get to that 6 months, remember there's pruning, there's sensitive periods. Now all of a sudden they start to specialize more and more until finally at 9 months, they're really able to tell Caucasian faces, but they can't really discern differences between different races. So what does this illustrate for us? One, definitely sensitive periods, right? So this pruning is happening at 6 and 9 months. But two, that experience is really mattering. So when babies of any race have much more experience with individuals from different races or who may look differently, they're also going to continue to have the kind of expertise that you actually have on the onset. But if this expertise is perceived as unnecessary, then it gets pruned away. If you don't use it, you lose it. Okay, so I do want to pause here to take a moment. One of the things that is happening with COVID is that because babies are not being able to see as many faces, right, face to face, or even when they do, they're seeing masks, you're getting actually less input into this system and less varied input as well into this system. And we obviously, this is very young for now, and most of you are not working with toddlers, but something to think about for later on, that we may experience this kind of lower expertise when it comes to faces, especially those who are uniquely different from what we expect from our families. All right, so what about adolescence? I think often people think of adolescence as this moment, again, when the aliens steal their baby. So we really prize a lot executive function and self-control. What is executive function? Executive function, excuse me. Well, one, flexible attention, right? I can shift from one thing to the other. I can talk to you. I can also be aware of what's going on outside. And I can also just, my rabbit is over here making a bunch of noise that you might not be able to listen to, but I have a really good way of blocking that out. Working memory, and then of course, inhibition and planning, which is the one that everyone worries about because they're like, adolescents are such risk takers. So a lot is happening in an adolescence. And remember how we said we're going from inner to outer, and the inner stuff is where like all of the emotional things are happening, and the outer stuff, especially the prefrontal cortex, which is later on in development, that's taking a little longer. And so this inhibition, planning, flexible attention, all of that stuff is not quite online at the same time that all of this like proliferation of this kind of very emotional middle area is developing, and motivational area as well. Okay, so there are neural changes that map on to this, the changes in emotional experience. So to orient you here, so on the x-axis, we see age, and on the y-axis, we see the amygdala, which is this area that's very sensitive to especially negative emotions, but also to like this faces and facial and negative facial expressions as well. And what we see is that over time, you actually have like a slower response, sort of like a less intense response in this neural area as you're older. But here, when you're a teenager, you're still having a pretty high response. Now, okay, you see like, yeah, but it's all going down. So what's up with the teenagery effects? Well, what's happening is that at the same time that these kinds of areas are developing and they're still pretty strong, you also have these prefrontal areas not yet developing. So this is the area of the brain that does a lot more of the like self-controlling sort of part. This is more like visceral. So there's a little bit of evaluation happening here. And what you see here, especially for negative emotions, it takes a while before you have the sort of architecture, especially to try and deal with negative emotions. And over time, you are less visceral kind of about it, and it's going down. So again, you have this kind of, in general, the younger you are, the more you have like these intense responses, both subjectively, it seems, but also neurally. And what's really happening, though, that's different is that self-control in terms of especially regulating negative emotions really doesn't come online into, later on. So a little empathy for our good teenage friends who are dealing with a lot and then not having the kind of architecture necessary. And also at this point, expectations are changing, right? So children have tantrums all the time, right? Toddlers, but we are able to sort of go with it and teach them and really put ourselves as their sort of prefrontal cortex. When it comes to teenagers, we're sort of like, okay, you need to figure that out. Like, I can't do that for you anymore. You're very big. Okay, so what does this actually mean for this like post-COVID resilience? Well, I think it's about going back into the kind of goals that we're talking about. So thinking about how do we build empathy through the kind of knowledge that we're talking about. So I've shown here today, one, that the brain develops into sort of conspiracy with the environment, right? It's really listening in to what's going on. And that social relationships are central to brain development and health. And that sensitive periods allow us to have a greater effect during those moments. And finally, and I hope that you guys have kind of picked this up as I go along, that differences are not necessarily deficits, because essentially the brain is growing and then pruning anything that is unnecessary and promoting the things that seem to be, that it's sort of predicting will be useful in the future. So thinking about all those things, right? That is part of understanding where the youth are in those moments. How, I don't think I need to tell you guys how you know that, like, right, like the kid who bullies probably is also being bullied in some way, sometimes by their own parents, right? There are a lot of issues that are going on with the environment that then produce the kinds of behaviors, some of which are disruptive. But part of it is that at the behavioral level and at the neural level, very literally, whatever the experiences are around this child, this growing person, is pushing them towards one thing or towards the other. But importantly, social relationships, the kind of relationships that you might have or that people that you supervise have, can be really meaningful and important to these neural connections. So you want kids who are, have sustained attention, who are able to handle their emotions well. Social relationships are a place where you can really show a child and really the brain itself that this is useful. This is a useful skill to have, but it really needs to happen. It's not enough to just say, do it. It needs to actually have positive consequences that are there. Okay, so building some empathy, but also strategies here. So one, working with neurodiversity and not against it. So yes, there's neurodiversity in terms of like ADHD and ASD, absolutely, and that's a little bit separate, but not completely either. But there's also just neurodiversity in terms of experiences molding our brains a little bit different. So a little more reward sensitivity than someone else, a little less executive function than someone else. But this is not inherently bad. Someone who is, for example, reward sensitive might actually have quite a bit of motivation if you direct them towards the right things. And this is, I know I've had a lot of experience with adolescents with this. You take that amazing energy and that fearlessness, and you gear it towards something that is valued in society or positive, and all of a sudden you have a completely different kid, right? That motivation can actually be a very, very good thing. It's actually protective against depression. Okay, appreciating the roles of relationships with the brain, both the mental and physical health. So how do we work together to cultivate social relationships in order to create healthy brains and healthy individuals? How do we really tap into that? And importantly, also thinking about related to this, thinking about the way that COVID might be changing some of this, including as low level as perception, but also with some of the skills that might not be developing when you don't have that kind of social stimulation that has been, I mean, think about those handprints, right? It's been since 10,000 years ago at the very least, and a lot longer, more like 100,000 years ago. And also understanding sensitive periods. Can we take those periods like adolescence to really create unique programming? Can we take even that early period of face perception, and can we help sort of mitigate some of the issues with like race blindness and all sorts of things that are basically exacerbated through lack of experience and content. So thinking about the way that we can use that trajectory in order to intervene. And then finally, this principle of community neuroscience. And here's where I'm sort of like planting the seed and hoping like you run with it. You know, it takes a village and a lot of brains working together. So one of the things that I hope that you can do after this is share this knowledge with parents and other providers, help them understand the kinds of changes that are happening in the brain for youth, the ways that it's interacting with things like the lower social contact, and also with, you know, understanding their own stressors and how much they're taking on, because truly it takes a village. And for a lot of people, that village shrunk to like one other person, maybe one other adult, right? And that's extremely difficult. Also share it with youth, help them understand themselves. Notice this behavior with youth of wanting to really know more about themselves in adolescence, and they start like looking at like Myers-Briggs personality tests or BuzzFeed tests or whatever. So there's this inherent curiosity about the self and one's identity. And why not talk about it through neuroscience, especially if it's going to encourage youth to sort of pursue that kind of knowledge and see it as something that they can do as well. And then, you know, again, talked about approaching neuroscience and any kind of advice with curiosity and not necessarily blind acceptance. This means myself as well. Please ask a lot of questions. And adults have brains too. So that's you guys. And your brains, my brain, is certainly also developing. And what's happening is also affecting us. That lower social contact is affecting us. The lack of change in context for many of us, like working from home, does impact us. So I mentioned the hippocampus, which has to do with memory. It's extremely sensitive to context. And so when context isn't changed, you're going to see some pruning. Luckily, the hippocampus is like the most flexible part of the brain. So happily, I think we'll be back on track. But something to think about. If your brain's a little foggy, you think your memory is not that good, it's like, well, there's some things that your brain is kind of used to as input that, you know, especially when the pandemic was in full throes, we really weren't getting. And so having that compassion for yourself as well. How do we create communities that understand that this is who we are fundamentally, and that we need to take care of ourselves from inside out? Okay, so I think I'll leave it here. And I'd just like to have kind of what we've learned about today. And I'm really excited to take your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gonzalez. That was really very inspiring and interesting and thought-provoking in so many ways. And I would love to invite the audience to submit questions via the Q&A feature, if possible. I saw there were a couple of questions in the chat. There was one related to examples. You're also getting a lot of love. And,
yes, thank you.
Yeah. And there was one related to examples, and maybe that question could just be posed in the Q&A feature as to what that was. And here we are. So I have a first question. If you're ready, I will read it to you. Mm-hmm. Yes. So hearing the value of social interaction, how does a parent introduce this to a child who might be socially resistant?
Yeah. So one of my biggest worries when the pandemic was sort of in starting, actually, and I realized that there was going to be quarantining, is I was very worried about especially individuals who have like a proclivity towards social anxiety, where, and this goes for adults and youth, but it's because of the formative nature of things in youth, it ends up being really important. But anxiety at the end of the day really is fear, right? So it's a fear of others. And when the way you actually treat anxiety is through exposure. So if I'm sort of a nervous person around people, but I go into work every day and I have good positive experiences every day, that actually is literally teaching my brain, oh, other human beings are actually pretty cool. And I might always be slightly more anxious than somebody else who just by nature of that, that clay that I showed you, right? It's just a little more sensitive to the social world. I might always be like that, but that exposure really helps me. So again, experience is really shaping some of that. And so with a kid and with anybody, that social resistance, I always say, no man is an island, but you can get stuck in one where you're kind of like, you're far away and somebody else is on a shore being like, it's really good over here, you got to come over here, but like when somebody is afraid, telling them it's better over here and having them canoe their way to your side is really, you're asking a lot, right? So instead, I think for that socially resistant child or socially anxious child, it's best to meet them where they're at and say, I understand that this is uncomfortable for you. I understand that, like really get to the meat of what is happening for this child. What are the things that they are afraid of? And then try to encourage small positive social interactions that over time increase in the length of time or the kind of difficulty of the activity over time. So yes, there are differences in sort of our ease with the social world, but some of what eases that, right, is experience and positive experiences. And how we do that is a more complicated question, but as a sort of like overarching theme, it's meet the youth where they are at, and then try and kind of like touch the water. Maybe they'll get on the kayak with you. Maybe they'll go a little out and you got to go back. And that sort of graduated kind of experience. It's a lot of work, but I think ultimately, especially with this like context, it becomes really important to meet kids where they're at this moment.
Thank you so much. That's definitely a very comprehensive response. There's another question here that has to do with the pruning process as we, as the brain continues to develop. And this has to do with if children grow up in ethnically diverse environments or do not grow up in ethnically diverse environments, rather, will this pruning also lead to various types of people having a lack of empathy or even tolerance for not having been exposed to, ethnically diverse communities? Yeah,
so this is the part where it's like, stay curious, but don't think any of this is like, the truth with a capital T necessarily. The shortest answer is, in this sort of deterministic way, no. I would not say that that's true. But in a more complicated neuroscience-y sort of way, there is at least some evidence to suggest, one, you have some of the blindness effect, right? So literally, because you haven't had these experiences before, you're going to have difficulty telling people apart who are from a different ethnic background as you, or just look different than sort of what you expect in your families. That's true. Now, in terms of empathy, there is some work indicating that the more somebody sort of seems like you, right, this perception of like you, the more empathy and also like perspective taking that you engage in. But like you is not just from physical attributes, especially as children. You can actually quite easily manipulate what us is, right? So you can do like just watch kids like when I was a kid, it was dodgeball, which is a horrible sport, but like you put kids into teams and man, they really get in it together, and you can change sort of like that perception of who is us, right? So there's a really famous experiment of like having, it was kind of inspired by Lord of the Flies. There's really famous experiments where they had Black kids and white kids in like the 1950s in a camp, and then they were showing that like the kids fought each other and there's this like parochialness that happened, blah blah blah. What is untold about that experiment is that there were previous experiments before that didn't work. And one of the major things that happened is actually the kids from both groups got together, and that was their us, and they went against the adults because they perceived that the adults were manipulating them, which they were. So it totally made sense. So it's more to say that that idea that there isn't like some sort of fate, right? Like if you don't have these experiences now, you're fated to then be unable to do these things later on. It is more difficult. And there are ways, but there's still ways in which the brain, which is beautiful, beautiful, malleable organ, can learn new things. It might require more effort, more kind of prefrontal sort of perspective taking and thinking, but by God, thank goodness, we can still do it. We can still arrive at empathy and also values and perspective taking, for sure.
Thank you so much. Definitely good examples. Here's a different direction of questions. Are there any programs that you've seen that hold youth's attention, but also are beneficial during those sensitive periods of times that you mentioned, particularly for teens?
Okay, so if I understand that correctly, essentially, is there some sort of like either intervention or program that can both hold the adolescent's attention, but also is sort of maybe teaching them something that we, right, might perceive as valuable or good? Is that what we're talking about? Okay.
Right, and I think yeah, and also sensitive to those, specific times that, the brain goes through.
Yeah. So I would say I don't think that there's anything out there that I'm convinced. Like I have seen some like brain training programs and things like that. I haven't seen anything that has convinced me that is better than social interaction and doing things. I'm talking about learning an instrument, learning languages, being part of theater, dance, coding. Coding is a really good one. Actually, if I can push anybody towards like that obsessive adolescent mind towards anything, coding has a very quick reinforcement schedule. So as you like writing scripts, it tells you whether you did it wrong or not. And this is actually like really great for adolescents and also individuals with ADHD. That's me. In that you're constantly getting this feedback, and it's almost like you kind of get obsessive with it and you keep going, and it just really funnels a lot of that energy towards creation. But in general, when it comes to brain development, and this is true of adolescence, but this is also true even like when we're talking about the aging brain and the sort of like fear of dementia and all this other stuff. And they're like, oh, here are these brain training things, that you can do, or vitamins or something that can be taken. Probably the most kind of interesting thing to your brain is other people communication and complex but rewarding activities. And that doesn't sound like, I don't know, that's not a pill, right? That's experience, that's community, that's living. And so, nope, I don't know of a program, but if you can capture that child's attention into something they love, whatever it is, and not be judgmental about it, whatever it is, and help them pursue that, I think this is personal opinion, somewhat informed. That's the thing that really matters, right? Complex, gratifying activity that's going to get an adolescent to continue to do that, and it feeds who they are as a person, and it makes their mood better, and it gives them a sense of purpose. I'm throwing my hat, like, what is it? I'm throwing it into that hat. That's my vote. that's my vote.
Yes.
Other people may disagree, but that's my vote.
Yes, and I think it kind of goes to what you said, that you have to really do things. So you have to do these 4 points that we're seeing here
Yes.
to really engage. It's not enough to just say it or to set it up and leave. You have to actually live it.
Experience, that's right. Yes, that is absolutely right. For the brain, the semantics are sort of in and out, but experience, that sticks.
Yes. So I'm going to throw in a question here too, because I think one of the big concerns specifically in schools is that we're trying to catch students up academically. But it feels like, in some way that's in contradiction to really making up the time, of experiences that we can have in order to really prepare for that.
Okay, yeah. So now we're getting to the part where I'm like really giving you my opinion on this. Again, knowledge, right? So knowledge, facts, we can get that almost any time. There is some evidence suggesting that like language becomes a lot harder as you're older. So there may be some things there, like I can't, kind of like with the primates, there are sounds that we kind of have a really hard time with. So there's like a famous Mandarin poem that's just sh, 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 sh. I can't hear the difference, but if you spoke Mandarin, you would know that it's a whole story about Mr. Xi and a lion. I can't hear it, right? So yeah, that's a little bit difficult later on. But in general, given like a healthy brain, the accrual of facts is easy. What is much harder, in my opinion, is self-reflection, is self-control, is having a sense of orientation. Where am I going? Insight, all of these things that are harder to get once you get into a pattern of not reflecting, of not kind of saying, that didn't work so great, in the future I will do X, like not planning, right? That to me is much more important, helping students catch up in terms of their social emotional development. And facts will come. But I don't think that that's the most important piece. And again, at that point, you're getting my opinion. And I understand that there are like state tests, which like personally, I find very upsetting that that's what you think is the most important thing for youth right now. But again, that you're getting into the realm of my opinion. Informed, but still an opinion.
Yes, thank you. Well, you certainly have quite a few of graphs that, indicate sort of the sequence of development and the ability to take in complex, cognitive parts as, the brain and we emotionally and socially evolve. But so switching gears a little to our younger audiences. So here's one question that was, as a facilitator of a few new moms groups, we have moved to online sessions. And is there any research into the impact on babies' brain development in regards to becoming aware of adults, of other adults or children. The moms are concerned about the delays in speech and, you know, other moms.
Yeah. So so first, let me say, yes, that is a concern. That's a kind of short answer to it. You're just having far less stimuli. And we know from research, both in humans and non-humans, that the richness of an environment, so in other words, like how many different and novel things are around, but also how adults are paying attention to you, does matter in terms of, like, remember we talked about the white matter development and how long it takes. That continuous sort of interesting social stimuli really helps what's called alienation. So that's the highways of the brain. So yes, I do feel a little concerned in that. One of the reasons is because if you only have one adult, the one adult is going to get tired, right? Like they can't keep up that level of engagement with a child. They have way too much energy. And as an adult, you're doing a million other things, even if it's just a million other things. So there's that loss of, like, the expectations for the specific individual suddenly are way higher because others can't do it. And to be fair, single parents deal with this all the time. So yes, there's that. My hope is, one, there is some evidence suggesting that the stimuli through the computer does seem to be doing something. Like babies do learn about faces through visual stimuli. They actually did that study through an online, one version of it through an online platform through Zoom. There's that. And the other thing is that still the brain is really incredibly resilient and malleable and has a lot of, like, redundancy. So my hope is that the sort of catch up can happen with just more enriching experiences. And again, I really want to emphasize enriching. This isn't about the accrual of information. This is about living enrichingly, right? So yes, it is a concern for me, but I also think there's some cause to be hopeful, and I'm also hoping that people will recognize how important community is and how much really, like, the isolated nuclear family thing. One, I don't really know if that's ever really true, that that's the way people raise children, but two, it's not tenable. Like children, it takes a village. Certainly neurally, it takes a village.
Yeah, thank you. I love that so much. And I also really appreciate you pointing out how exhausting that can be for one caregiver, or, you know, yes, to really take on that role and to kind of put out, you know, a plug for activation of protective factors that include really social connections and building those pods if needed. Yeah. There's another question going back to adults here. And yes, there's a lot. So I'm going to read it to you. It's a little longer.
Okay.
So first of all, it's really wonderful and helpful what you've presented. And then in working with parents and community, I'm wondering what might be the most immediate supports we can provide. And this person is saying, I'm finding that parents and community want immediate solutions to the challenges, and they don't want to hear about what the pandemic has created or the exasperation, the challenges our youth are having. You know, even sometimes we're seeing a great deal of anger, fighting, disrespect from youth to adults and vice versa, and unwillingness by adults to step away from the agenda.
Wow. Yeah. It is really, really hard to be an educator right now. So yeah, my heart goes out to you. And I do think there's a bit of this that we need to think about empathy for ourselves and for the youth and for the parents who are dealing with this, because you're talking about really, really a lot of stress from all sides and a lot of what we would call a kind of deprivation, right? Like the inputs that really from an evolutionary time point that is being expected by the brain, the kind of quality and richness is kind of decreased in this shortened time period, as in the way that that children and adolescents are regulated by adults. Adults regulate each other as well and are also impacted by children, and in general tend to act as like the youth's prefrontal cortex often. So you're working double time, right? So you're stressed, you're managing your own stress, but then you're also trying to manage the stress of a child. And if you're an educator, you're trying to manage your own stress. You've got kids too, probably, right? Like you have like your own thing, and then you're trying to manage youth and parents, and then you're also trying to like mediate some of this that's happening. So that's a whirlwind. One of the things that I think is important, or at least would be useful, and I think you guys would know better than me how feasible this kind of is. It would be useful if parents stopped looking at you as the person or the institution that's supposed to fix everything, and instead look at it as look at each other as partners, right? Like you're the community, you're all of that, right? You're not just a place where children go. You're really helping raise people. You're part of that, and that is a collaborative act with parents. And so I would love to see greater empathy, but also an alignment of values. I do think there's something off about, and I think particularly anxiety provoking from parents about saying, oh, we need to catch up, you know? And then the parent is thinking, oh my God, my kid is not going to be able to pass this test, which means they won't get a good SAT score, which means they won't go to a good college, which means they're not going to be able to get a really good job. This is really dire. Oh my God, educator, fix it, right? Like that's the process that's kind of going on. And so some of it, I think, is a value change that needs to happen, and a real looking at this as partnerships. There's no way a parent or an educator by themselves can handle this. Oh, and by the way, especially with adolescents and even with younger kids, you can bring them in on it too. Honestly, like why not ask adolescents, hey, in this 2-year period, what do you feel like has been really missing? What do you wish that we were doing? And again, meet them on their island, because when they're motivated, everything is like so much easier, right? It just goes, and that partnership I think is important. And how to build that, I do think it's difficult. Every time I hear, I don't go myself because I don't have children, but every time I hear about like parent teacher conferences and stuff, I'm like, that's so combative. Like, what are we doing? Why? I don't know what has made this happen, but if we can rearrange the conversation and instead of being defensive, being more of like, yeah, you're right, this is a problem. Yeah, your child is really struggling. So am I, and so are you. How can we do this thing during this unprecedented time? Let's be creative about it. So meeting as partners rather than, I just don't think that, I'm basically saying, dear educators, it is not your job to fix this. It's not possible. So it's best to just say, hey parent, I can't fix this, but we can maybe do it together. That's good. Like, yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. I think this is really like kind of summarizing and preparing us too for the afternoon and tomorrow in such a beautiful way to, to what you've done just in this last 2 minutes is really centering the voices of children and young people, yes, and to make sure that they have a spot on, in
Absolutely.
in the community, and then everyone being part of that mold that you showed us, right? That we all contribute to that, and how we're in relationship with one another. And I really want to thank you. You're getting a lot of comments in the chat. We'll make sure to save it. People are really enjoying this and finding this helpful. So, and so am I. Really, thank you so very much. I'm going to put a link to a survey in the chat that we would love participants to respond to. And then I just want to, point out before we log off that, thank the participants, you all, for coming, making time to talk about this here. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more questions. We definitely need repeats and have this conversation ongoing. Just to say that, we will have the afternoon session starting at 1:00 today. Recordings will be available via email, the one that you registered with. And we hope you will also stay with us, because there are more webinars to follow in next year on a monthly basis. We have a really exciting lineup of speakers every Thursday of the month, every second Thursday of the month. From 3:30 to 4:30, we have Dr. Ken Ginsberg as one of our speakers. If you don't know him, look him up. You don't want to miss him, as well as other wonderful speakers. And yes, tomorrow's panel discussion will also be facilitated by a recent high school graduate and college student now, and we have young people participate in the panel, and we really want to make sure you hear from them. So Dr. Gonzalez, thank you again so much. You've definitely made neuroscience sound like a little rock star experience.
Cool.
I've had a lot of aha moments, and really appreciate this, and want to thank the audience again for joining us.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. This is really what the Cornell Neuroscience Initiative, Community Neuroscience Initiative, is trying to do. I'm writing because we are developing some more materials, and we're hoping to have more on neuroliteracy and things that might be helpful to parents and educators later on. So please look us up. Right now you can sign up for our, we're building sort of a list of people who'd be interested. So we would love to see you there if you guys are interested in more. We just want to be of service. So I'm really, really happy that I was able to do this. And thank you everybody for all the sweet comments and the really wonderful engagement. So thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, so there are questions around where to sign up. I think I'm going to include a link for that in the follow-up email. Yes.
Yes, that would be absolutely wonderful. Thank you, everyone.